I'd like to welcome tonight's speaker, Mr. Chris Twiggs. It's quite hard to find out very much about Chris, but in fact, he was recommended to me by two people, well, actually members of the society here, but also someone who's totally unrelated to the London Scientific Society, a former teaching friend. I know that Chris is a member of the Western Press Association, and he actually gave an award-winning Global History Symposium talk. Now, tonight's topic, as you can see, Captain Sidney John Sankey, but I'll allow Chris to introduce himself more formally and tell us a lot more about this gentleman with a very local link. So thank you very much, Chris.
Right, thank you very much, and I presume you can all hear me nice and clearly. Yeah, excellent. Just to give you a little bit more detail about myself, I spent 32 years as a history teacher, and which explains largely my interest in the distant past, doesn't it? And I retired in 2009, and then spent about 4 years doing part-time work. I was a tutor for courses dealing with Britain and the Great War for the Workers' Education Association. And amongst other things I got involved in was the project in Wolverhampton to write the book, Wolverhampton's Wars. So I wrote 3 chapters of that book. One of the chapters deals with the full contribution of the Sankey family. So, why Captain Sidney John Sankey? Because my interest in him came about purely by accident. Let's have a look at the man himself. There you go, rather fine portrait of him. I think probably taken when he's about 21, 22. I came across him purely by accident. So I've got to take you about 20 years to 2005. And I was then in my second year of teaching, having moved from my original school. I was second year of teaching at Colton Hills Community School in Wolverhampton. And I was in the process of setting up the First World War Battlefields tour. For the following year. And as part of that, I wanted to try and find a local man, local to Colton Hill School, and spoiler alert here, a local man with a grave somewhere on the Western Front that would fit in with our itinerary. So, going back 20 years, of course, there wasn't quite so much on the internet, but there was enough. And 2 sources of information were particularly useful to me. One of which was an Express and Star that got part of its website dedicated to a list of all the soldiers from Wolverhampton who'd been killed in the First World War and also where they were buried. And that threw up a number of possibilities. And then I went and looked at a rather good website by a chap called Doug Lewis called Wolverhampton War Memorials. And eventually I ended up looking at the War Memorial here. St Bartholomew's Church in Penn. And the man I was pursuing was Sidney John Sankey. He appeared on the War Memorial in that church. And because he was local, I had vague ideas about trying to sort of set up a potential walk for the pupils so they could have followed him around where he may have walked back in the early 1900s when the family lived in the area. And also, of course, we could then explore where he went during the First World War. And there's the War Memorial in St Bart's Church. That's not my picture. It's not very clear. You won't be able to see Sidney John Sankey's name on there because of the flash from the camera flash. But it's better than the attempts I made, which were even worse. So take it from me, he is on the War Memorial there. And this had the added bonus at the time that the pupils at Colton Hills who were studying religious education, as part of their RE courses, they visited local mosque, local temple, Sikh temple, if I remember right, at the time I was at the school, and a church. And this was the church they went to. And I shared an office with the head of RE, and so we had a quick discussion, and I said, well, next time the kids go to St Bart's, can you try and make sure they be pointed at the War Memorial? And that was about as far as it got. And eventually we got round to the tour. More about that a little later on. But when I retired, I got a bit more time to actually investigate Sidney John Sankey. And it appears on an amazing number of war memorials. Now, I would imagine most soldiers' families would be quite pleased if, their family member appeared on one war memorial. But he's got quite a few. So he's on St Bart's. This is the war memorial at Darlington Street Methodist Church in Wolverhampton, right, which is now a banqueting centre, by the way. He's on that. Why is he on that? Because that branch of the Sankey family were Methodists. Right? That explains his appearance there. He also appears on these war memorials. These are the war memorials now in St Leonard's Church in Bilston, and they are the war memorials for the workers of Joseph Sankey and Sons of Bilston. And if you go and have a look on that, you'll notice that all the names are there. It says Sidney John Sankey, brackets, director. So you're under no illusion to that, notwithstanding that he's, part of the family business is slightly more important than everybody else. So that's another 7 war memorials. And I thought to myself, well, that's probably it, isn't it? But no, he turns up here. This is St Michael's and All Angels in Tetnall. It's quite an old photograph because it's been refurbished since then. And that threw up the question of, well, why is he there then? And it turns out he's there because the woman he was due to marry attended that church. So she made sure, come the end of the war, when they were putting up memorials, he's commemorated on that one. He's also on this one. This is his father's grave in Merrydale Cemetery in Wolverhampton. And although you won't be able to see it, some of the writing down below the cross mentions Sidney John having been killed in the First World War. So, hope you're keeping count. And then finally we get sort of one-born connection. Right, and this, as you can see, St Benedict Episcopal Church in Wombourne is on the war memorial there. And the question is, well, why is he on the war memorial there? That's because in 1911, the Sankey family lived at the Foxhills in Wombourne. And although you probably won't be able to read the detail there, at the time of the census, John Sankey, his father, and Elsie, his mother, were actually away on the south coast in a hotel, and you'll be pleased to know they took one of their servants with them on holiday. Right? The rest of the poor souls, I don't know whether they have a sweepstake or, choose a card and see if you're the lucky one that goes with them. But they've got 4 servants there. At the time, they've got 2 daughters there. Sidney John is the 3rd one down, right? And he is described as an electrical engineer. And indeed, he's working for the family business. But that's the connection. I've not been able to find out exactly when they moved to the Foxhills. Right? But I do know by the time of his death in 1915, mother has moved out, and I assume the family moved out as well, and they're living on the Penn Road somewhere. So that's your Wombourne connection. It may have only been for a few years, but there you go. He is, in one sense, a local man. So, by the time I went on the battlefield tour, which took place in 2007, I'd amassed a small amount of information so that when we went to visit his grave, I could explain to the pupils a little bit about the background story, essentially about his war record, which is the bulk of my talk, by the way. And you'll see a lot more about that in a moment. But I got very little idea at that particular time, really, that the importance of the Sankey business in Bilston, or indeed much about his earlier life. But over the years, it sort of slowly unfolded, and indeed it continues to unfold really into this year. So it's pretty much, I think, a bit of a work in progress, really. So what do we know about his early life? Well, he was born in 1889. Mum was Elsie Sankey, father John, and they lived not here, but originally in Goldthorne Road. It was pretty much just around the corner from that building. And sometime in the 1890s, they purchased this property, Claremont in Penn Road, Wolverhampton. And I guess if we could bring Sidney John back to life and say, what was your childhood home? He would probably say, that's where his childhood was. This is home. John Sankey bought it from another Wolverhampton businessman, industrialist, and extended it. And the extension is up the thing the bit on the side there. It's, I think, at the moment, still the property of the Royal School. That picture dates from about 15 years ago, and I was walking down Darlington Street, and I don't know what caught my eye about it, but I looked in, I think can't remember which estate agent it was. Might have been Walker Barney Hill or something like that. But I saw a picture and I saw Claremont Penn Road. And I thought, oh, I know that address. And there was a brochure there in the window, and I went in, and they got very excited when I said, can I take a brochure for Claremont on Penn Road? And they said, yes. And next thing they said was, would you like to book a viewing? And I said, I know teachers' pensions are too, but I don't think they're going to stretch to this one. And so they finally gave me the brochure, which in itself was quite interesting because it got this cracking photograph, but also some pictures of the interior. And at some point it had been used for the boarders at the Royal Store. So there you go, nice property. And they lived there until the 1900s, when they must have moved on to the Foxhills in between the 1901 census and the 1911 census. So that's the family home for his childhood. We move on to the 1901 census, and when I came to look at who's living at Claremont and the Penn Road, Sidney wasn't there. And I was his younger brother, Charles Reginald. And eventually when they turned up in this entry. Now, if you've had any dealings with doing research on family history and you come across a page looking like this, you tend to know two things. If there are lots of people's names and lots of people who are teenagers, you've probably got two possibilities. One, it's a young offenders institution, right? And two, it's a boarding school. Now, you'll be pleased to know that the Sankey family and their children were well brought up, and they didn't even get involved in petty crime. And no, this isn't an early Borstal institution. It's in Denbighshire, and it's actually a boarding school. And down here, there's one other thing that's worth pointing out. One of the perils of not checking your documents. You can see them down there, Sidney J. Sankey and Charles R. Sankey, and whoever filled in this document moved their birthplace from Wolverhampton to Woodford Green in Essex, which could throw you completely. And indeed, if you've ever gone on to Ancestry and looked at other people's, particularly Americans, by the way, are there any Americans in the Hornets? I'm on safe ground there. But Americans seem to have a very casual attitude to checking their facts when it comes to constructing family trees. So they'll believe anything you tell them without checking the facts. And on a few of the Sankey family trees, those two boys are actually believed to have been born in Essex. No, they weren't. Whichever member of staff filled this in got them very muddled, because you can see there's Wolverhampton. Staffordshire should have been it. More interestingly, that's the school. Today it still exists as Rydal Penrose School in Colwyn Bay, which on the left is sort of contemporary with when Sidney was there. And that other picture is probably sometime within the last 10, 15 years. My question is, why have they gone there? Now, I've researched lots of elements of the Sankey family. Traditionally, the school for which boys of the Sankey family get sent to is Wolverhampton Grammar School. Right, if you look at George Sankey, John's brother, he sent all his children to Wolverhampton Grammar School. But they got sent there. And the reason is it's run by the Methodists. I think it was quite unique back in the early 1900s. I think it probably still is to then. So the family's commitment to Methodism explained why the sons were packed off to this. In 1907, Sidney, at the age of 18, finished his secondary education, and the expectation is go to university, young man. But not in the UK. So he went off to McGill University, which is in Montreal. It's unusual. I don't know what caused that to be his choice. I do know that he went to McGill. He was there for 1 year, and he did a course in applied engineering, which does make sense because of the family business as such. But he successfully completed that. And if you go on their website, he appears on their First World War memorial. And you can look through the pages of all the students who were killed in the First World War. So off he goes to that. And so life was ticking over quite nicely. He's back in the UK in 1908, and he's beginning to start work at the Albert Street Works in Bilston. The expectation is within the next 10 years or so, his father John, who at the time was the chairman, he would retire. He was in his mid-50s by the time of the 1911 census. He would retire, and at some point, Sidney would take over as the driving force behind the family business, which was doing very well at the time. And also to be ticking over quite nicely over the next couple of years. And then we moved into 1913. Sidney makes a move which is going to have consequences. Because of the sort of social circles he mixed in, he, as the son of a prominent businessman in Wolverhampton, and because it's what some of his contemporaries did, he got himself commissioned into the territorial force, what today we would call the Territorial Army. And in 1930, he was commissioned as a junior subaltern, the second lieutenant, the lowest rank in the army, in the Wolverhampton Territorial Force, the 6th Battalion of the South Staffordshire Regiment. Part-time soldiers. But he got the right sort of backgrounds, right family connections, university educated, ideal. Right? So even though it's not the full-time regular army, that's the sort of person they're looking for to be an officer. He ticks all the boxes, he gets the commission. So he's progressing at the family business, he's about to move into the junior ranks of the territorial force. What could possibly go wrong? What could possibly go wrong happened at Luddington Manor near Stratford-upon-Avon in November the 2nd, 1913. John Sankey had gone down there to see his brother Harry, who was a farmer, nothing to do with the family business in Bilston, and he dropped down dead with a heart attack. So suddenly Sankeys are thrown into chaos. That's John Sankey, driving force chairman, has died. His brother George, who I think was a couple of years older, wasn't really planning to have to be dragged back into that role at that stage of his life, but he did. So George Sankey took over as the chairman because they thought that Sidney's going to need a few more years of experience. So, bit of a crisis, but as we move into 1940, I think they've got it sorted. Oh dear, oh dear. Right, because in the middle of 1940, this mob turned up, right, and suddenly not just Sankeys, but the whole of Europe's thrown into trouble. This is the German army on the march through Belgium into northern France, because they have taken a key step and caused what became the First World War. I won't bore you with all the background to it, but essentially, right, we have a crisis in the Balkans revolving around the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. The Austro-Hungarians' key allies are the Germans. The Austrians' opponents over this whole dispute are the Serbs. They're backed by the Russians. And the Germans, planning to protect themselves, has for a good few years worked around the basis of having a war plan that as soon as they will be attacked on two fronts, essentially by France, possibly Britain in the west, Russia in the east, and the plan was knock out the weakest one, which they thought would be the French in the west, do that within 6 weeks, sign a peace treaty. Right, good job Donald Trump wasn't involved in it by now. And then concentrate on what they thought would be a serious war against the Russians. Great plan, But as we all know, with any great plans, the moment it falls apart is the moment you put it into practice. And part of this plan, what men go through Belgium and Luxembourg. And Belgium was neutral. The Germans asked for permission to take their army through the lowlands of Belgium to attack France. The Belgians said no. Right, the Germans went ahead. Belgians then invoked the Treaty of London of 1839, which guaranteed their neutrality, and that had been signed by Britain and France, and indeed Prussia, the main state of what became Germany. So we all go to war, and on August the 4th, 1914, Britain goes to war in response to the Germans infringing Belgian neutrality. What does that mean for Sid? Well, Sidney is actually on summer camp at this moment. If you join the territorial force, part of your commitment was 2 weeks of a summer camp, right, which would involve an intensive period of military training, and then obviously you would have weekly meetings Friday or Saturday nights. But they were on, I think they'd actually just arrived at their base for the summer camp. They got the call, you need to come back to Wolverhampton, right, you're being mobilised for a war. So things again got very hectic, this time not in Bilston, but certainly with Sidney's part in the territorial force. And this is going to end up them on the Western Front. So, I'll come to these people in a second. Sidney has an important choice to make when he's back in Wolverhampton. As a member of the territorial force, you have no automatic commitment to fighting abroad. You have to sign up for that. You're not in the regular army. You've joined the territorial force, essentially there to sort of feed through potential future soldiers, but in theory to be a sort of a glorified home guard. Right. But we all know in 1914 the Royal Navy was going to stop anybody ever getting close to the shores of the UK. But in this situation, members of the territorial force were asked whether they were prepared to sign up for overseas for that service. And as you can imagine, the pressure from your fellow officers probably weighed on the minds of all of them, Sidney included. But we know that he pretty much signed up immediately on August the 4th. The 6th Battalion spent a few days in Wolverhampton getting itself sorted out, and on August the 11th he marched off to Burton-on-Trent. And after a short stay there, it went south to Luton, and at the end of November it was in Saffron Walden. Territorial forces were looked down upon by the British regular army as not proper soldiers, sort of boyish amateurs. So the expectation was it will take 6 months to knock them into shape before you can really send them over to do some serious fighting. 6 months from mobilisation. And this is a photograph that I know will be familiar to some of you. It's in the front of history of the 6th Battalion, the South Staffordshire Regiment, written in 1924 by a committee of officers. So it's a bit sort of what we did and the rest of the soldiers barely get a mention. But these are 32 men photographed at Saffron Walden in November of 1914. They are the original officers. When they came back to Wolverhampton in August, and there was a sorting out process and people signed up for overseas service, right, it became clear not everybody could just sort of drop everything and decide they want to go and fight in France and Belgium. You've got people who are GPs, for example, who just can't give up job like that. You've got people with business commitments. You've got people with family commitments. And then there were some of these people who might have been in that photograph but weren't because they were deemed too old or actually never going to be physically strong enough to endure life at the front. So if you look at a list of the officers who were involved in this battalion at the start of 1940, it's rather different to the list you can see here. But what have we got? Right, well, the man who circled, that's our man, Sidney John Sankey, looking the part. Right, so by that time, he has been promoted to the rank of lieutenant. Right. If you look at all of them, they all look pretty serious. A number have got the classic moustache, which was, good feature at the time. There's one or two that are interesting. Just to the left of Sidney, right, the man over here, that's Howard Mander. And if you look at that picture closely enough, he appears to be the only person showing any sign of enthusiasm. Right? He's actually got what looks like a smile. Right? And oddly enough, he is one of the rare members of that group that was actually still in the Sixth Class Staffs and intact at the end of the war. Right? The ones that fascinate me are down in the middle row, front row here, this little group of three who look genuinely worried, as though, oh God, we've bitten off more than we can chew, or oh God, what is going to happen? What have we let ourselves eat for? Many of them might have been thinking that when they actually joined the territorial force, because I doubt whether many of them really thought it was ever going to lead to such serious war as the First World War. These three all look very young and very, very concerned. When I first looked at them, I got a sort of flashback to my childhood. Do any of you remember Five Boys chocolate bars? Right? And I think if I remember rightly, you used to get a picture of 5 boys on the back of that, and they ranged from looking sort of quite depressed and upset to smiling. And I almost thought they could sort of fit in there somewhere, really. And they do look, and they probably were, the youngest members of the officer class. What else do we know about them? What else do we know about Sidney's friends? This lot, 32 of them, 10 of them get killed. Some of them get wounded very early on. Some of them lose limbs. Many get sent back because of various injuries and are then deemed not fit enough for frontline service. One of them gets shot by his own revolver in his thigh. The chaplain, this guy here, was killed when a car drove up behind his horse. He bolted and threw him off and he died from his injuries. And some of these, one of them managed to blow himself up. A few were just victims of random casual shedding by Germans. You may notice one character here who doesn't so quite fit the bill. That's because most of these men have got a Wolverhampton connection, and it's this chap here who's wearing a Glengarry. Right. This is Captain Charles William Eric Gordon of the Black Watch, a professional soldier with a background of fighting in South Africa, and I often compare it to Mr. Mackay in Porridge. Right? Very much matter of fact, everything done by the book, right? No messing around, no sense of humour, and he's sent in there to shake them all up, along with a couple of Sergeant Major characters, to make sure that this lot realise, no, you aren't going to France or Belgium for an extended version of summer camp. You're going there, and some of you will be killed. Right? And the best way you make sure it's not you is to take it seriously. So he goes in and he really does shake them up. And when he leaves in the summer of 1915, there's a sort of like, oh, thank God for that, you know. But he's done his job. He wasn't popular with the other officers, but he did his job. And he was very good. And by the way, he got promoted, became in charge of a brigade. And then, like sod's law, he was walking back from a battlefront at one stage and was killed by a random shell coming over and killing him and a fellow officer. But this lot, they know each other. They would have met each other professionally through business organisations. Many of them were solicitors, stage agents, right? Mr. Finnis, I think that's Finnis at the back there. He worked for William Butler's Brewery. You get a fair old cross-section, right? And they knew each other from Wolverhampton Cricket Club, through playing golf, through being Freemasons, and even through intermarriage. So they're a sort of tightly connected group of men, but 10 of them don't make it, including poor old Sidney. So, 6 months of training, during which they all learned to be good soldiers, and then, in March 1st, 1915, they are sent by train to Southampton. They're ready to be dispatched to the Western Front. Shipping traffic going from Southampton to France took the route across to Le Havre. And as you can see, March the 2nd, late in the day, they got on the boat for Le Havre. It's an overnight crossing to minimise the trouble from submarines. They arrived the following day at Le Havre, and they spend 2 or 3 days getting kitted out, and then all this information you can get off the battalion war diary, which you can download for free from the National Archives. Some war diaries are very interesting, packed full of detail. This one is very matter-of-fact. You're lucky if you get more than 2 lines per day. But it did allow me to sort of trace their footsteps. So as you can see, March the 6th, they get a train ride. Right? I shall see when I show you some photographs in a minute. Not the sort of train ride you'll be queuing up to take part in. But there's an awful lot of marching as they make their way across northern France, towards their destination in Belgium. And pretty much 5 weeks after arriving in France, they are in the frontline trenches properly for the first time, just over the border in Belgium, at a place called Bourvignon. So, the great thing about this is somebody took some photographs. Ta-da! One of the officers on there was Percival James Slater. He was the signalman responsible for telephone communications for the battalion. His nickname, perhaps not surprisingly, was Pip Jock. That's Percy Slater. His mum eventually became the mayor of Warsaw, because that's where he came from. Unfortunately, his mum was killed in the German Zeppelin raid in 1916 as a result of the Germans bombing Warsaw. But he took the camera with him, and the British Army banged cameras in the trenches eventually. Right? So I don't know whether technically he was breaking regulations here, because this isn't in the trenches, but I'm glad he did. This is shortly after arrival at the Havre, and the men are being fitted out with additional equipment. And the thing they got really excited about was these goatskin jerkins, so they're given to keep them warm. Right, so they're queuing up and some of them are gotten. I gather they were quite good unless they got wet, in which case she began to smell like a very wet dog. Right? Now, I guess probably in the trenches nobody would care. But there you go. They were getting themselves kitted out. It took a couple of days, and then they got their train ride. Hey-ho. Right, he took a photograph of that. So here he is, photographing his colleagues about to enter the train at Le Havre to take them on to Noordpen in northern France. That train consisted of one rather battered old, I guess, third-class carriage for the officers, with nice, uncomfortable wooden seats. Right, no heating. And the men got these livestock wagons, which were usually stamped 8 horses or 40 men. Right? And in a concession to comfort, the men of the 6th Battalion South Staffs were allowed to get into these wagons and be counted off as only 37 per wagon. So, a bit of elbow room. Right? And 2 bales of straw, over which they can presumably have a fight. The train moved at a painfully slow speed. It's not unusual for people to talk about soldiers being able to jump off slow-moving trains, pop into a village, buy some refreshments, and get back on the train. Even the officers complained about the state of the coach. And one of them said that they'd had to go up to the engine driver and get some hot water from the boiler to shave in the following day. So it wasn't fun, and if you read enough stuff about the First World War, these journeys are miserable to varying degrees. But Percy Slater took some pictures and stuck with this. From Noordpen, it's all marching, and the usual format was march for, let's say, 15, 20 miles, and then you'd stop, be billeted on upslope of farms or cottages, right? The officers would get the best accommodation available, right, which might be at the local chateau, right? You'd have a rest for a day and then move on. Not very pleasing. The locals reacted in different ways. Some of them were grateful for the presence of the British, others regarded them as a nuisance. And here we go again. This is a stop on one of the marches. You'll notice the officers have got horses. Some souls amongst the ranks have got cycles, which you might think, oh, that's nice. But I can tell you from my experience cycling on cobbles in France and Belgium, no, it isn't. Not after a while. Here's another stop. All looks very idyllic, doesn't it? You know, you're thinking, oh, this is nice. A little stroll through the countryside. And here we are, the officers' mess while on the move. And eventually, they reach civilization, Armentières, in northern France. Now this one, I haven't worked out what this is. They're in Armentières, and the officers have gone to a hotel to see what is available in the restaurant. Right? The other ranks have been basically told to sort yourself out. But the officers there are illegally looking for some decent food. And Sidney will be amongst them there somewhere. Difficult to pick him out in that picture. Now we do have one other source of pictures for this period. And this one comes from Howard Mander's collection. It's interesting. I don't know whether it was taken in Britain or possibly just over in France when they got there. We've got Regimental Sergeant Major Burgoyne, one of those men brought in from a professional soldier to shake up the 6th Battalion. He survived the war. We've got Captain Lewis, that's Edwin Lewis, and Billy Lewis. Right, he is one of the last of the men to die in the last few weeks of the war. We've got Lieutenant Sankey, and then we've got Lieutenant Howard Smith, a bit of a character, the good cricketer. His nickname was the Anarchist, which might tell you something about his approach to things. Then Fred or Frank Langley. The 3 in the middle don't survive. They're all dead. They're all killed at various stages during the fighting. So, having made their journey all the way to Wolverhampton, where exactly are they? Right. So, basically, they're there in what's known as the Ypres salient. Ypres is that small little town in Belgium that you tend to associate with the Menin Gate on the last post. It was a key city, a very small city of about 15,000. But holding on to it was important because if the Germans took Ypres, they'd got a clean sweep across open ground, flat land, to the Channel ports, and Britain's knocked out the war. So when Sidney and the battalion arrive here, they've got an important role. To give you some idea where the front line is at that particular time, in April of 1915, it's this line here. Right, the Germans had captured the high grounds to the south of Ypres in the autumn of 1914, and then things had settled down. Winter had arrived, no movement, people dig trenches, and in April the 6th, 1950, Sidney and his men get the first taste of life on the front line. They're in a position just along here, just to the north of this road. And it becomes their home for the next 3 months. Now, a few miles back from the front line, I think probably 4 or 5 miles back from the front line, is the village of Neuve-Église, which they came to know very well. Just outside of Neuve-Église, this road runs out to the French border. Before the First World War, there was a steam-powered tram system that ran down the side of the road. You can see it there. And the camp that Sidney and his men were in was just up to the left of those trees, and it was known as Bulford Camp, after Bulford Camp on Salisbury Plain. It was a combination of huts and tents. Nothing to write home about, but very quickly the men realised that that was quite decent accommodation. You know, you weren't in a tent in a muddy field. You got the option sometimes lucky enough to be in a wood hut. So that became their base. Bulford Camp would be far enough away to be out of range of German guns. So you were safe there. You really could try and switch off. Right. Further up that road, though, is Neuve-Église itself. This is the centre of Neuve-Église, taken just before the war. By the time Sidney arrived there, this village had received a bit of a battering. About half the houses had been demolished. Virtually everyone, to some degree, had been damaged. One of the soldiers in Sidney's unit wrote home to Wolverhampton, and the parents passed the letter on to the Express and Star. And he described the village of Nerviglees and the village of Wolvergum as being pretty little towns. Right? They really are villages, although today Nerviglees is probably a very small town. And he described one of them, didn't say which one, as looking like Codsall, right? Except it had been visited upon by the Germans who had wrecked the place. Right? So this became, for 3 months, this became very familiar to them. The routine was 4 days in the trenches, 4 days in reserve, 4 days in the trenches, 4 days in reserve, right? Because 4 days of the frontline trench, it's pretty exhausting experience. You're going to be cold, you're going to be damp, and if you're getting a bit casual, you're going to be dead. And here they are, amongst the photographs taken by Percival Slater. This is Nerviglees. Nerviglees, you've got its own brewery. So, despite the risks of having your bath disturbed by the Germans, soldiers did occasionally use the brewery vats for bathing purposes. In this case, they've got an old farm cart, and somebody's there filling it with water. Right? And as you can see, you just pile in. Right? A lot of these bathing arrangements were pretty basic. You know, because if you get into the bath water in a brewery vat and you are number 115 there, right, you're going to take one look at the water and think, do I really want to do this? And the answer is, no, you don't, but you will do because it's the only option you've got. And we are at a time when things like body lice are becoming a major issue. Right? One of the things that Percival filmed was a picture of them boiling shirts in great big tubs, because that was one way in which they thought they could get rid of the lice eggs. So it was becoming a bit of a demanding existence, back and forth from the front line, trying to keep yourself reasonably clean. So, what's it actually like in the front line up at Wolvergum? Right, another map for you, just to give you some idea. If you follow this road here, right, the red line is the German front line, the blue line is the British front line. You can see there's quite a network of German trenches. There's a network of British trenches. Behind them, there are some farms, which will now be abandoned by the farmers, by the way. And just off my map is the village of Wolvergum. Right? So you can see where they were. And like I said earlier, they're to the north of that road. So essentially, this territory here and a little bit here is Sidney, Sankey and the South Stabs. What does it actually look like? Well, good old Percy Slater. This is South Midland Farm, which at the time was being used as a dump for supplies and a bit of a sort of communications base. Taking a battering, but you can see the nature of the trenches they're building. Right? Because the water table is very high in that part of Flanders, you can't dig down the 8 feet you need to protect yourself in the frontline trench. You have to build it up with sandbags and earth at the front, because otherwise you'll be knee-deep in water. Here's North Midland Farm. Right. John's made a pretty good job of that one. And here's another farm, Souvenir Farm. Right, and you can see the trench system that they've got there. Right. By the end of the war, that would just be a pile of rubble. But it would be very familiar to Sidney. This is where he moved in his everyday experience. If he's not fighting, he's got a whole range of tasks. Checking the state of the men's feet, checking their rifles, checking their equipment, giving them tasks to do during the day, deciding who's going to be on trench repair at night time, who's going to be on sentry duty, censoring the letters home. He is a busy man before you even get round to fighting. And indeed, as the rest of his fellow officers. This is described as Trench 8 at Wolvergum. There is another picture of the trenches at Wolvergum. I think that is possibly looking directly towards Massey's Ridge, and those trees are along the road that was on the map. And that's it today. Now, I took that picture a few years ago using a GPS device, finding in where the British front line was, and on the ridge there is the village of the Seeds. Right, so the Germans are on the high grounds, looking down on the British. Right, and building over there is quite interesting, is Massey's Church itself. destroyed completely during the war, but it's gained a bit of fame because Adolf Hitler sheltered there at one stage during the early years of the war. So you get some idea of the terrain. It's not a mountain that the Germans want, it's just a gentle rising land. But it gives them a commanding view. And if you were to go on the top of the Messines Ridge, which I've done many times, you just look down at the land in front of you. And if you go up the top of Messines Church, you can see, well, to the English Channel. It's an amazing view. So they stay there at Wolvergun for April, May and June. They lose some casualties. The first one is a guy called Private Butler from Wolverhampton. Right? They lose a couple of officers. The first officer casualty, not killed, was a bloke called Stewart who got shot through the thighs. But the first dead was the bombing officer of the South Saps, Joyson. He unfortunately blew himself up while demonstrating how to take a grenade apart and tapped to the fuse on the table, and it went bang and killed him and injured a couple of others. And the other casualty was a Lieutenant Bostock, who was just a random shelling victim, if you like. But they got away quite lightly, and they're more experienced. And then, hey-ho, the good news, oh dear, you're going to Hill 60. And Hill 60 is somewhere that was probably the most feared spot on the Western Front in the middle of 1915. It's a nightmare. Here's Hill 60, slap bang in the middle of the map up here. But, it's a very heavily fought over piece of land. It's a hill created by the building of the railway line from Ypres through to Commies down the bottom there. And it's 60 metres above sea level. And again, it's on that high ground that gives you a commanding view. Here's an aerial shot for a British aircraft. You see Hill 60 down the bottom. You can just make out the trench system, can't you? The white lines as such. But the British and German lines are so close together, you're quite sure yards apart at some point. You could hear the other side talking. And you'd be very unwise to stick your head anywhere near the top. Mm-hmm. Usual route up there, I can show you, was along the railway line for cover. So that little path along there you can see in light blue from Shrapnel Corner was the usual route up to Hill 60, keeping yourself out of the eyes of Germans, and obviously done at night time as well. About a mile away from Hill 60, the little village of Zillebeck. Again, this would have been familiar to Sidney, except it would have looked like that. Right, there's the church, already suffered severe damage. Church towers are great for observation, so the enemy will try and blow them up. You might even want to blow them up because they stand out like a sore foe. They're a good sort of indicator for enemy artillery to aim at. So this is the sort of village, again, that would be very much something in Sydney we're used to. And here's a trench map showing you the state of trenches at Hill 60. I think that dates from 1917, but it's not changed that much. What you can't see is what's going on underground, because they're tunnelling under each other and detonating big mines. So if I were to add the underground workings, that would be beyond confusing. It wouldn't just be lines going off all over the place. But you can see it's a very complicated system. Why is it important to gain control of Hill 60? Well, as I said just now, it's high ground. This is a German view from Hill 60, and you can see, again, if you've got high-power binoculars or a telescope, you can see a lot more what's going on in front of you. Right? That's a view from about 20 years ago. That's similar sort of position, looking across the Ypres, the distance, and you can see there in front, just beyond the rails there, some ostriches. That's too. I know there were school parties, and the pupils said to me, or one of them, he said, "Sir, what are they?" And I said, "They're ostriches." "Oh, why have they got ostriches?" I said, "Well, ostrich meat's very nice." Well, I wouldn't like it. Okay, fair enough. That evening, we're back at the hostel we're staying at, and the guy who ran the hostel was very keen on barbecues. So he did some very nice sausages and so forth, and some burgers. Right? And when the kids stopped in for the burgers, because you can't keep children away from burgers, can Then one or two said, "These aren't beef, are they, sir?" I said, "No, they're not. No, they're pork." Right? Because I don't tell them that they're ostrich cheeseburgers. I thought if I do that, there'll be a rebellion. So fortunately, they never knew. Except they definitely weren't beef burgers. Here we go. This is quite a well-known photograph of some men in a six-house stash up at Hill 60. I do like the bloke in the middle with his traditional flat cap. Right, a bit of civilian life existing on the front line. But this is what Hill 60 looked like from a wider view. It is a shambles. Just to the left you can see the railway line on the tunnel, or the bridge, sorry, crossing it. Very disturbed land, trees sort of decimated, and if you'd got the full picture, large mine craters all over the place. A real nightmare in which to fight. And if you needed to look over the top to see what's going on, this is what you should use, some form of trench periscope. What you definitely don't want to do is stick your head over the top, because you will get killed. Right, so here we can see some very sensible men using a trench periscope. Right. Unfortunately, Sidney Sankey didn't use a trench periscope, and he stuck his head over the parapet on the night of the 24th, 25th of September 1915, and he got shot right through the head. Not quite killed instantly, but died within a few minutes. Unfortunately, and I came across this very early on in my research, we've actually got an account here from the Colonel's diary. And as you can see, it says, during the night of the 24th, 25th September, the Brigadier called and inquired if a patrol had been sent out from Trench 37 and asked it should be made an officer's patrol. Sankey was commanding the company, Billy Lewis being on leave, and he sent Nelson, a new officer, out. Apparently Sankey got anxious as Nelson did not immediately return and took a look over the parapet. He was shot through the head and brought down to Lane's dugout. Lane, by the way, is the medical officer of the battalion, right, in so hopeless a condition that obviously nothing could be done. He died at 4:30 a.m. Poor boy. Sidney John, as he was affectionately called by the other officers, was a sound, quiet boy with plenty of ability, which did not once appear on the surface. Extremely zealous and dependable, always anxious to be working. I'd seen much of it in this last week in 37, and he was full of good ideas. And then the killer bit at the end. The tragedy of it is that he was going home in a week or two to be married and had applied for a special 10 days leave for the purpose. He joined the battalion about 4 years ago. We buried him in Larchwood in the afternoon. Very, very sad. Right. Nelson, by the way, one of the things I didn't discover for many years, Walter Nelson appears on the war memorial in Treacle Village, by the church. And I could not work out for the life of me why he's there, because he's a man from Warwick. His family ran a gelatine business and some other business in south of Warwickshire. And at one stage, before the First World War, he just left the family business and went off and joined the French Foreign Legion, as you do. And when the war broke out, he left the French Foreign Legion and applied for a commission of the British Army. He's a man of about 45, so much older than Sidney. He arrives here, he's been sent out, and of course it's his failure to return on time that partly explains Sidney's death. It took me a long time to realise the reason he's on Treacle War Memorial, and that is because his sister was married to Benjamin Mander. So another sort of strange, quirky connection. Right, that's the Expression Star's brief comment and photograph about Sankey's death. That is his will. I'll just speed through this last bit, but the will's good because it tells you who the woman was he was planning to marry, Edith the Croft Crocott, who lived at Hollyhock Cottage on the Tettenhall Road. And he left her a lot in his will, which she was going to receive whether she got married or not. This is Trench 37's position today, and looking towards those trees where the German front line would be. So somewhere along that road there is where Sidney stuck his head over the parapet and got shot, and that's looking at it from the German front line in the other direction. So you can see there's a little patch of no man's land, but no great distance really. And he's buried now at Larchwood Railway Cutting. Very nice cemetery. I've visited on many occasions. You cross the railway track, you go down the path, and towards the back of the cemetery, there he is. So, this story started with commemoration on memorials and sort of ends with it. Go back to 2007, with the school trip we went on, and at about 11 o'clock in the morning, on our day given over to touring around Ypres, we went to Larchwood. I was there with 5 staff from 2 schools. We got about 23 pupils from Colton Hills, and about 24 pupils from Dartmouth High School in Soundlaw, which is where I originally taught. And we laid a wreath after I told them the story of Sidney Sankey. And one of the nice things about battlefields is you never quite know what might happen. Right? Sometimes things go wrong, sometimes you get an added bonus, and this one turned out to be an added bonus. Now, once I sort of explained Sankey's story, and we'd had the minute's silence, I realised that behind me there was a gentleman who was actually just wandering around the cemetery. And he came across to me and he said, "Excuse me, sir," he said, "can I say a few words?" And I said, "Yeah." His name was Bernard Comey. He lived locally, and he was interested in all the men buried in, I think, about 6 cemeteries around the area. But what he said had a profound effect on the pupils. And actually, what he said, I think, looking back at it from today's perspective, it would be a good idea, really. There was a lesson there for our sort of divisive times at the moment, and about the importance of understanding your country's history, your country's proper history, rather than the bit you'd like to think it's all about. He addressed the pupils, and he said, "I want to thank you on behalf of the Belgian people, right, for the part that soldiers from the United Kingdom did in saving my country during the First World War." Now, in a sense, that was unusual, right? But he also made a very specific point. Bear in mind, quite a few of our pupils were of ethnic Asian Indian background. He also made a point of saying, "And thank you very much to the soldiers from the British Empire at that time, particularly soldiers in the Indian Army who came and fought." I actually had a couple of kids who were in tears at the end of all that, and came up to me and said, "Sir, nobody's ever said anything like that to us before." And I was generally impressed, but the bloke really had quite an impact to actually acknowledge the fact that here we got a Belgian man who understood more about the history of the British in the First World War than a lot of people in this country have got even to this day. And understanding it's not just a white Europeans war. This was a war brought in, well, the French army, soldiers from Morocco and Algeria, for example. He brought in labourers from Vietnam, and the British side had brought in Chinese labourers. It was World War, and he knew about it, and that had quite an impact. So we laid a wreath there, and this story ends quite appropriately at the Menin Gate. But next year is the 100th anniversary of the inauguration of the Menin Gate. You'll probably realise at 8 o'clock every evening they play the last post there. Back in 2002, it reached the point where they were playing the last post for the, I think it's 25,000 occasion. And the decision was made by the Last Post Association for the next 12 months, a particular soldier would be commemorated on every particular day, just for the next 12 months. And the man that was commemorated on the 25th of September 2002 just happened to be Sidney Sankey. Thank you very much.